Welcome to Magnitude, where we discuss issues of great consequence. Today, my guest is Mr. Sanjeev Sabhlok. I came across Sanjeev's profile and was quite intrigued by his work. I'm going to give you a bit of background into the work that Sanjeev is doing and what he's done in the past. So Sanjeev actually joined the Indian Administrative Service back in 1982 and resigned in 2001 and came to Australia and did some work in the Treasury for the Victorian government. But in 2020, when Sanjeev saw the Victorian government's response to the events of the last 3 years, he decided to resign from there. Effectively, Sanjeev has been quite vocal about the violations of human rights and the police state created by the Daniel Andrews government. Sanjeev formed the Indian Policy Institute in 1998, Freedom Team of India in 2007, and Liberal Party of India in 2005. He's written a few books. His first book is called The Great Hysteria and the Broken State. No, actually, that's not the first book. That book was written in 2020. He also wrote a book called Seeing the Invisible in 2018. And he's got a free download of one of his books, Breaking Free of Nehru. Welcome, Sanjeev. It's great to have you here. How are you?
Our pleasure.
Thank you. It's quite an interesting, fascinating background. And I have so many questions based on the experience that you've had in India and then your reason for moving to Australia. And it appears that there is a little bit of disappointment in the way the political affairs and the economic affairs of this country are being run. I guess my first question is, why did you decide in the first place to quit the Indian civil services? How did you get into the Indian political space? And then how did that now result in you having an interest in Australian politics?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I was not interested in either politics or administration and was forced into that effectively by my father, who said, join the civil service. It's very prestigious. So I joined that. Then I realized it's full of corruption, massive corruption in India. My bosses, my ministers, my chief ministers, and I've written about that as well and named them as well. Then I started studying economics very diligently. So I was initially not an economics student. I was a science student. Then I studied economics for about 12 years altogether, including a PhD. By the end of the PhD, I came to the view that the whole thing really boils down to the policies. And so Indian policy is fundamentally socialist. And so there are two ideological strands. One is collectivism and one is individualism. It took me a long time to understand. I'm sorry about that. But by the time I finished understanding, then I realized that we only had one political party in India since independence called Swatantra Party by Rajaji. He had started this in 1959. It was actually a liberal party, got about 45 seats in the parliament. But after his death and after Indira Gandhi's resurgence in 71, that party basically died. And so there was no political party in India. I had nowhere to go. And so I basically started trying to form a party. Didn't work. Then I said, okay, let me resign my job in India and then go to Australia because I have been studying here. I came here for studies and I liked the place. So I came here. I wasn't really interested in citizenship. But after 5 years of failures to get some things happening in India, despite extraordinary amount of work in that space, nothing kicked off. And you mentioned Liberal Party of India, which I started in 2005. That is one of the failed projects, unfortunately. And so I finally took citizenship of Australia in 2005, late 2005, and then been supporting people in the Indian political space for till now, very actively actually, called Swatantra Party. We have got a party doing a pretty good job in terms of promoting the ideas of liberty, but it's nowhere in the political space. So that was the reason why once I realized that these ideologies are really important and India is smitten by this socialist ideology. And of course, when I looked at the RSS, which is the ideology of Modi, RSS is, by the way, called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, which is the self kind of volunteers of India. These people are basically the spin-off of Mussolini's fascism. So their history is entirely fascist. So these two ideologies, and then Hayek's work taught me that they're the same thing. And so I've been working around trying to get India fixed, so-called. And then in Australia, I did the job in the Treasury thinking I'll learn a lot, and I learned a lot. By the way, I really loved the job here. Amazing work that I did in the Treasury, learning, etc. all the time. And then and to me, that was a role model. And so by the time in 2020, when that itself collapsed, what I was fighting against was fascism and socialism and collectivism and so on. And yet we saw that happen
in India.
Yeah, I was fighting that in India, but then I found it happened here. And at that stage, as you said, it just, when they started, choking women, the police start choking women who was not wearing a mask and, pushing a car against somebody, I got a bit upset and wrote 1984 on my Twitter account. And they asked me, oh, guys, you got to remove everything that you put on Twitter. And I've been writing a lot of articles in Times of India, by the way, around, what the policies should be. So I said, no, I'm not doing that. I resigned on the spot. So no, that was my second job gone, unfortunately.
So when you came to Australia, in the beginning, you would have had, you looked at the Australian form of governance. And at that time, did you think that it was incredibly different from the way things were being done in India?
Absolutely. I loved it in every single regard. I couldn't think of a better, well-managed place than even the USA, because I did a PhD in the USA. I studied USA quite a lot, and no, this was superior to the USA as well. So I wrote in my book, the Breaking Free of Nehru book that you mentioned, that was in 2008. And I really used the Australian model as an example of what India could become. And I was very impressed, sadly.
So that would have caused a fair bit of, I guess, cognitive dissonance, because
Absolutely.
So what do you think? And do you think that this is something that's only happened recently, or do you think that's always had maybe roots of that in the past, but it's just starting to become evident now?
Well, I personally I still haven't got around to understanding what really happened. Trying to piece together the pieces. For example, there's a Liberal Party in Australia, right? And we have people like John Howard and then Tony Abbott and even the Matthew Guy, the local, representative in Bulleen. These people I had a lot of faith in, a lot of hope in, that they would actually speak out. And Tony Abbott did speak out a little bit positively. In fact, I was in a conference he was there. So international conference, I was invited. Tony Abbott was there, and many other, senior ministers from UK and Israel. And so that conference, he spoke very well. And Matthew Guy was there, and they all spoke well. But, at the end of the day, the Liberal Party failed. So I was initially thinking, okay, maybe I should go and join the Liberal Party. Liberal Party sounds like a good idea. But then I realized, no, they're not doing that at all. They're not interested. They're basically looking for the votes. And by the time the hysteria has already formed, the mass hysteria in society, people want these, intrusive policies. They're responding to that in their self-interest. So the politicians who are probably forgot their ideology and went into this thing supporting most of the things that were going on, including people like Scott Morrison supporting lockdowns here, border closures, etc. So the rationality which I expected to come from the liberal side of the politics, which I thought was going to support us, and even, by the way, the labor side of Australia has been, in terms of economic sense, you think of Paul Keating as the reformer, right? So we didn't reform, from the liberal side of Australian politics. We reformed in the economic sense from the, labor side. And so there was and I really enjoyed working with people like, John Lenders was the treasurer and then Premier of Australia, Victoria. And even my current, Tim Wells, the treasurer in Victoria, I thought he's a good guy. I mean, many of my recommendations in town planning, he would support them. It took them to the cabinet, got Andrews to agree to them, and we got a lot of good work happening. So I had a lot of faith in both the parties, and that collapsed. And so to me, that's been a bit of a shock, right? It's not cognitive dissonance. It's like saying, what could have gone wrong? And so I'm trying to pinpoint the ideological. So in economics, we have the thing that, a cost-benefit analysis, in my view, is the differentiation. It creates the differentiation between India and Australia. So they don't do a cost-benefit analysis of anything in India. Here they do for everything except in environment and public health. Now, public health, I was not really interested ever in my life. It's like a side issue for me. Environment, I had done a lot of studies in climate, etc., and wrote a lot about that. But in public health, took me by surprise. But they actually do not have cost-benefit requirement. They have a precautionary principle requirement. And this is very, very, this says I don't need to really prove anything. If I feel it's going to be quite a bad thing, I better do something right now.
What is the precautionary principle?
The precautionary principle basically says, in the face of something that could go wrong, it's better to do something than to keep waiting for evidence. That's the sum and the sense of it. And it was embedded in the environmental regulation through the 1992 Rio de Janeiro Declaration, led by people like Maurice Strong in the UNEP. He's the guy basically who took that principle into the United Nations. But then I'm discovering that in public health, it's been implemented in 1976 as well by this then CDC director, David Sensa, who actually said he actually spent vast amounts of money on a vaccine, which actually then caused harm for a disease at that time called swine flu, which almost caused just a few hundred deaths in the USA. So for almost nothing, he spent a vast amount of money, and then later he defended himself, saying, in cases of where lives are involved, it's better to have an overreaction than an underreaction. And to me, that is the most irrational thing to say, because what you're doing here is not spending your money. You see, the reason we say everybody, economy, why this is because if you're going to spend other people's money, which is the taxpayers' money, you better do some analysis about it and prove your case, because otherwise it's not good enough for David Sensa to say, or Anthony Fauci to say, or Brett Sutton to say, that this is going to happen, so let's do this. It's for the whole of the cabinet to agree. And for that, there is a department, and there are hundreds of economists in the Treasury in Victoria. And our job is really to quiz and ask the departments for proof for everything. But in this case, our department, my executive director in the economics group, he basically asked him, he said, no, this is a matter we are letting the health department just, dictate the terms here. Well, we never do that in the Treasury. And that's the big failure. So I'm looking at the failures and the pinch points. The Western civilization has evolved very carefully, from the medieval era, where the king's whim and arbitrary policies were implemented, to the point where we have a kind of a cabinet system and advice from economists and the whole lot of, central agencies. Now, many people don't know what it is, a central agency. Basically, there are line agencies and departments which do the various things, education, health, etc. And then there are two departments called central agencies. One is the premiers, or in the case of the Prime Minister's department, and the other is the Treasury. These two actually they don't implement anything. The only job that we have, the two departments, is to really interrogate all the other departments. If you need money, you need to prove it. If you're going to do a policy, you need to prove it. These two departments, in the case of public health, they completely failed. So that's the kind of thing which I've identified in my book itself in 2020. And now I'm going into much more detail through a review of public health itself. So I don't understand why the Liberal Party failed. To me, that has been the biggest problem. And I'm hoping one day, there was a group of young liberals who interviewed me, and I said, look, you young liberals get your act together, because if you don't get back the concept of liberalism and embed it back into the society, it's actually a cakewalk for the other side. They are going to completely impose their views, random, arbitrary views without proof, and this is going to become a norm. So lockdowns are going to get much worse in the future. Mandatory masks, and so anything that these guys think of will become the law, because you guys have abandoned the field. Where is liberalism in Australia today? That's, I think, the real issue.
Well, you mentioned public health a lot. It appears that from 2020, your views have changed a lot. Is that mainly because of the lockdown response, the pandemic response that we witnessed in the last 3 years?
Yes. Oh, there's a guy called Richard Easterlin. Richard Easterlin is one of the most famous economists in the world. He was on my committee, and we had long chats with him all the time. And he used to say public health is one of the greatest boons. And in his book he wrote, and he taught us about public health being the sanitation and all that stuff. And we agree. We all agree. It's great stuff. So I had a very positive hello about public health. I'd not
until 2020.
Until 2020, I'd not even really carefully thought about the quarantine system, and maybe it's some excesses here and there, etc., which I discovered much later they were happening. What really blew my mind was that something happening in China, of all the places, the lockdowns were invented in China. I studied very carefully. I said, where are the lockdowns? Where did they ever happen? No, there's never happened in any Western country. Is there any book which recommends it? No, there's no textbook. I did all the research very quickly and found that this is completely cooked up by this Chinese guy. Xi Jinping or whatever his name.
So there was no economic analysis done, cost-benefit analysis done on lockdowns at all. It was just a heavy-handed approach. That's what it seemed like to the average person anyway.
Absolutely. And in fact, they copied, of all the people to copy, they copied China. So to me, that was itself the most alarming thing, that you're copying China in doing things and the pictures came of people being locked down and sealed in the doors. And so, having been in India for half my life and worked there for 20 years, I sort of thought about the poor guys who actually get a daily wage laborers. They go to get a job. They have to work that day to survive. And so for me, the first thing was, why are we even thinking of this crazy thing where these people are not being affected? So the age profile was very clear. It's only people above 80 or 70 get 1,000 times more risk than the people who are very young. And so if there's no real risk for these guys, the young workers of India who are feeding their families and little children, how in heaven's name can you have a lockdown? So I wrote lots of articles about that, by the way. So to me, the whole logic didn't add up from the beginning. And so I wrote a lot in Times of India articles. I kept talking within the department. I wrote emails within the department and I've FOI'd them and I've got them published on my blog. Basically, I gave enough warnings to everybody. This is really wrong. This is really bad. This is going to harm Australia. It's going to harm India. It's going to harm the whole world. Why are we doing this? Nobody listened. So then finally they started beating up young, people. And then I said, that's enough. That's enough. I'm going to, quit and fight these guys. And I've been doing it ever since for 3 years now.
Do you think this is a byproduct of that collectivism that you're talking about? Because it appears to have permeated the entire world. It appears that the Western philosophies and Western way of life is very much what was embedded in individualism. But it appears that there seems to be a global shift towards collectivism, which is why we're seeing, am I right in saying that this is why the Democrats in the United States, the political party that's led by Modi in India, the Labour Party now is obviously taken over the whole country. Do you think this is where the philosophy that's really driving this is the average person is embracing collectivism, or is it actually being imposed upon us? Under the banner of doing things under the greater good?
Yes, I think that's the point I was going to make. The beauty of collectivism, and that's the beauty of socialism, I've seen it all through my life in India and others, is that the promises made are wonderful. If you tell me that you're going to take care of me from my birth, cradle to grave kind of thing, you're going to feed me, you're going to look after my education, my children, my health, my whatever, then of course I'd love you as a politician. So what's the point about liberalism is it's extremely hard to explain to the common person. It's been a miracle of some sort that for about 150 or 200 years, we've had a spurt of liberalism across the world, probably from around the time of John Stuart Mill, Bentham, etc. And then it peaked probably in the time of Ronald Reagan. I can't think of, having outlasted him. Thatcher and Reagan, they basically were the ones where it sort of peaked at that point. And after the Cold War was over, people gave up and said, oh, it's all good, it's gone. So at that time, they were actually funding liberalism across the world. Liberalism requires a lot of funding to explain to people what it means. It's so natural. Socialism is natural. Collectivism is natural. If people want to respect authority. So, there's a Fauci, there's a Brett Sutton. Oh, yes, he's the chief health officer and he must be respected. And so if he says this, let's do it. So there's a lot of inbuilt tendency. So when I say it's a Nash equilibrium, the Nash equilibrium in society is medievalism and collectivism because it is so attractive. You have to fight against it quite a lot to get people to think differently. And the beauty of the thing was that people like Ronald Reagan had imposed the cost-benefit analysis requirement in the USA in 1980, and then we copied it in Australia. So people like Ronald Reagan had taken this to the frontier, saying, no, we will not do any policy unless it passes a cost-benefit test. That was the biggest achievement of liberalism that you got at that point. And that was completely distorted and eliminated during this period, particularly in public health, but also in environment and climate change and so on. So we've again lost the battle. So the battle that was won after nearly hundreds of years and finally got CBA embedded in the law, and that is the only thing that saved Australia. Let me assure you, I've been working for 15 years in the Treasury. The kind of rubbish that the departments send to us, the kind of bad policies, and we have to fight back and push them back and say, prove it and so on. It's amazing. You'll be surprised that the default position in all departments, whether it's education, health, planning, you name it, transport, is basically collectivism. The default position is, I know better. I'm the secretary of the department. I can tell you what to do. And our job in the central agencies was, no, you're not really better. You need to prove it to us. You have to prove it to us. And you're going to publish that CBA publicly. And so, by the way, you're aware that we publish the CBAs. They go through a consultation process. They go to a public consultation process. Anybody in society can put in objections to the cost-benefit analysis. And then that has to be responded by the minister. So we had a very good system built in across the board where the collectivists were being controlled. If we didn't have the CBA, they would just go, amok. And so that's what happened in public health, which we need to fix.
But some Australians will listen to this and say, what makes Australia great is the fact that we have Medicare and we have Centrelink. And that system has made us a wonderful country, an egalitarian society. But you are saying that collectivism in all forms is not preferable to individualism, because I mean, some people might compare that to the United States and say,
you're right. It's actually not really either or. So as John Stuart Mill would say, there's a requirement for government regulation in some places, and so we support that. So you need to stop people from, say, asbestos and so using asbestos and so on, or some other things that are really, really dangerous and bad. So that's fine. So this is called classical liberalism. The classical liberal mind is not really an either or mind. It's basically analytical mind. It's an open mind. It's asking for evidence. And so if you can prove it, that's why the cost benefit analysis is the evidence base. But remember, even Medicare or Centrelink and all these other good things, welfare system, if they don't pass the test of cost benefit, like every single PBS medicine goes through a cost effectiveness analysis, every single thing, anything that's approved. So that's been embedded. And so the classical liberals who actually are represented on this planet by the profession of economists. So economics, microeconomics particularly, economics is trained in these opportunity cost and trade-off concept, the trade-offs, right? So even Medicare, you can't overspend. If you were to overspend, what would happen? NDIS is a good example where overspending is happening. And guess what's happening? Is being eroded. So the first thing economists will say is, if you don't design your policy well, it's going to be eroded by people who are not deserving, which is what is happening in NDIS. Yes, of course. So we're not here to tell people whether they should have, welfare or not welfare. Welfare, by the way, is not collectivism. Welfare is saying it's the basic minimum. If you fall below that with all your best efforts, society should step in. And I think Hayek and Mises and everybody would support a little bit of that. Mill would support it, saying, okay, if you fall below a particular level, fair enough, we'll come in. Okay, but so it's not collectivism or individualism it's basically analysis, saying up to which point can you do Medicare, up to which point can you do NDIS, and which point can you do, say, quarantine. And I support a quarantine for Ebola. Let's say if I come to the country in Australia with Ebola showing symptoms and that can be transmitted, it is a good thing to take me and put me into a place where no one can catch it, right? So that's evidence-based.
So what you're advocating is just depending on the situation, rather than just having a blanket approach, which is what it appears to be happening.
Yes.
Assess every situation based on its consequences, merits, and then make a decision. I want to understand though. So are you governed by, and are you personally driven by the liberal ideology, or are you more would you consider yourself to be a conservative?
Okay. So there's a guy called Jeff Brennan who actually explained that conservatism is not even a philosophy, because conservatism, and he's got a very good point there. Basically, he's a professor in ANU. He just died last year, and I worked with his son, Michael Brennan, in the Treasury. So Jeff Brennan basically argued that, look, conservatism is, what are you conserving? So it depends upon what you're conserving. Are you conserving a good thing or are you conserving a bad thing? Right. So, and Hayek would say that generally speaking, what you're conserving is a good thing, because society has arrived at a point through some trial and error. So it's a good thing to be a conservative for the most part, which is what he was. But he wrote a very brilliant piece called "Why I Am Not a Conservative and Why I'm a Liberal." I forget the full title, but that's what he wrote. It's a chapter in his book, and he argues that liberalism is actually the most open-ended thing, which is I'll defend only things that are worth defending. I will start with the assumption that everything that happened in the past is worth defending. Then I will observe and see if it's worth defending. And if it's not, then I will change. So the fact that the person is willing to change makes him a liberal. So to me, there is no real conflict between the two, so long as you're defending the right thing. Because if you're being a conservative in the USSR and defending communism, you can be a conservative defending communism. That would not be, a good idea, right?
So rather than just preserving something for the sake of preserving it, you're actually, again, assessing everything on its merit.
And that's what is liberalism.
Yeah. Now, what was the main driver? I mean, you have become quite vocal about public health failure and the pandemic response. That seems to be one of the main things that you are talking about. What is the main reason that your focus has shifted so much on that?
Well, to me, it is like it's evidence for what can happen if we're not careful. So if our systems break down,
But what has happened? What has happened? What are you seeing as the aftermath of the pandemic response?
Very simply speaking, the cost-benefit analysis that Gigi Foster did, and I supported her. I did the drafting and all the calculations and other things. And so that shows that the harms of the lockdowns to Australia have been in the range of 68 to 100 or even more than any benefits. Okay, that's being very conservative, very positive about benefits. Okay, we achieved something. Well, actually, we didn't achieve much at all. But so that's the kind of analysis which shows that we've been imposing very dangerous policies. So the inflation, for example, we see today is a direct outcome of two things that happened during the lockdowns. One is the lockdowns and the shut supply chain being shut down across the world. The second was the money printing and borrowing. We've got humongous debts now. Chalmers was saying, it's a problem that I can't fix or something. And so really, why did we have to do this? So
that was expected, though. It's actually quite interesting that some people are acting surprised that this would have happened after.
Yeah, it's massive money printing.
You interrupted the supply chains, and then you're obviously printing money. That's typically, inflation is typically a consequence of that.
Indeed, that's basic economics.
But it appears that the governments across the world are not really taking any accountability for it. Why do you think that there seems to be a very coordinated response? It almost seems like a narrative that comes out in Canada and the United States is very similar to the narrative that comes out at the same time in Australia and New Zealand. What is going on? Where do you think this is coming from?
Well, the interesting thing was Rishi Sunak came out with an interview, trying to distance himself from these policies. And he said at the SAGE meetings in the UK, he would go and ask for proper cost benefit, etc. Then this was in 2022, after 2.5 years of these lockdowns. So the point I'm trying to make is that these guys have realized, I'm 100% sure that they've realized that they've caused enormous harm. And so he was trying to get out of this old thing. Then I'm a good guy. I was doing all these good things. The problem is he did not commission the cost benefit analysis. He could have done it himself. So if they do a cost benefit analysis, these guys will be exposed. So I've never come across a criminal who says, I'm a criminal. I've never done that in my life. You have to catch them. And so I've been catching them. The proofs that we have got of cost benefit analysis are clear. The public is not yet clear about it. And that's another part of the story, because these guys will not be brought to account unless the whole public agrees that this was caused by them.
There is a narrative that's floating around in the public domain for a lot of people who share your views. They're not happy with how the response around the pandemic. And there is a view floating around that a lot of our bureaucrats and politicians are not elected. They were selected through the intervention of bodies like the World Economic Forum and United Nations and World Health Organization, the World Bank, International Monetary Fund working. I mean, have you heard any of this? Is this a conspiracy theory? Or do you think that there's a possibility, because when you look at the media response, it seems to be so coordinated, and you see the same sort of narrative that the governments are pushing at the same time. You can't help but think that there seems to be some sort of a link between what's happening, especially across the G7 countries. What are your views on that?
Well, this is where I really am disappointed with people like Tony Abbott, right? So these are the leaders who should have stood up and fought again. He's not a WEF guy. He's an independent Rhodes Scholar and everything else. So there are people who have their own mind. Our own local guys, only a fraction of these leaders are from the WEF or linked to that. So the way it works is you have to fund this exercise. Liberalism cannot survive without massive funding. You need to train, you need to build, you need to bring the young people. So what the WEF has done, is basically they've done a massive training program for Malthusians. So Malthusians are the ones who say there's too much population. We need to stop the population. We need to do this with climate change policies. We need to do this. And we need to vaccinate. And by the way, vaccination is not directly intended to kill people, but it's actually intended to reduce the fertility rate, which is, I've got my PhD on that, I can explain later. But the point is, so Bill Gates, for example, is a big part of the whole WEF kind of agenda. So these people are Malthusians, and that's an ideology, a collectivist ideology that goes straight back to the other side of the liberalism. So what has happened is WEF is nothing but a branch of, let's say, collectivism. It's a new branch. It was probably got links to Nazi Germany, eugenics, and all. So there's a massive link of that side of the thinking process coming from Rousseau and so on. On the other side are these people like Hayek and so on, the Mont Pelerin Society and others. They've actually kept quiet. I mean, and many of them failed, and that's been a big issue for me, that many top economists actually failed to stand up for reason in this period. So if the liberals themselves don't know what is liberalism, how could they possibly stand for it? So I think liberalism has weakened internally to the point where even the liberal leaders do not know what it means. That's probably the case.
So what's the vision here? I mean, are you hoping that by the work that you're putting out, you can revive some enthusiasm for liberalism? What's your goal? What do you want to see happening in Australia?
I think my goal is to simply understand better, and therefore I keep on doing my reading, writings, and so on. So I'm actually, I have no delusions that I can influence anybody, right? Forget even my own family, for example. So I just do what I think is right. And at this point, my view is that I need to study public health and see when and where did it go wrong. Because when I look at it, it started by the liberals. Bentham, the guy with the cost-benefit analysis, everything begins with him. He's the guy who says, the greatest happiness of the greatest numbers. And that's the cost-benefit analysis approach. So the analytical approach started public health. He was the founder of public health. We had John Stuart Mill coming in and, talking a lot about public health. Wonderful people. And then we had this collapse where we say, okay, if something can go wrong, let's go and, shut the whole world down and do this and do that, etc. Or, produce, I think they produced 25 years worth of vaccines or something this time, right? Which is similar to what they did in the 1976 case with David Sencer, who was the Anthony Fauci of that particular period. So the fact that these guys have found that they've got these piles of money, all they have to do is to create a bit of a scare. The Congress in the USA and out here, the Parliament will just dump in money on them. Most of the money this goes into their pockets, either directly or indirectly, and they build their empires, which is public choice theory. So we've managed to get a situation where public health started as a science. It is based on medicine and good thinking and all the stuff about infectious disease and all the good stuff, and then it finally has shifted completely to a different place. So I think my hope is to finish this work that I've started, which is a review of the whole discipline. So there's never been a review of this discipline since it started about 150 years ago, 180 years ago. So mine is the first review. It's going to take 2 years of work, 1 million words at the minimum. I'm expecting volumes and volumes of material I'm collecting. It'll take a long time. That will help me to understand personally, which may help others. So my goal is not to really control anybody. They're independent. If they find it useful, that will hopefully influence somebody in the end. But we need to so the first thing is we need to get the precautionary principle removed. We need to get a cost-benefit analysis requirement included. So I've got about 10 different things, that I've already come to recommendations. And I'm going to be talking to a doctor shortly in an interview next couple of days, and I'll get his views as well. So my idea is to really understand by talking to people who know these things, so that I can then, hopefully what I write will be of some use to somebody.
But it appears that you also see that liberalism can potentially provide an antidote to how public health is being run, to bring in further accountability, to reduce the level of bureaucracy, and just a more efficient form of governance. So why would you not be pushing for that to happen and aligning yourself with the Liberal Party or doing something of that type of work to ensure that liberalism comes back into the Australian way of life?
Well, I'm very keen to support liberalism everywhere in the world, right? So in India, for example, I spend a fair amount of time, even today, talking to people in India and getting that Liberal Party of India, supporting it through writings and other organizational work, etc. In this particular country, I think I more or less have given up. I've been asking for the young liberals of, I think it was Macquarie University. They had a long interview, and then I explained to them, said, look, the current Liberal Party has failed. I can't think of people like Matthew Guy or whatever, being liberals anymore. I don't see the way they talk, Scott Morrison and whatnot. They're not liberals. So how could they even do liberal things? So the first thing is you need to get the young people up and running. And then you either infiltrate this party and then, it gets back on track, or you start a new party. So really, as far as I'm concerned, the journey for Australia's reform is extremely difficult because we've lost people like Tony Abbott, who's not speaking up, and he was very supportive of my work when I resigned. He wrote a nice piece in the Facebook, and in the interview we had in the conference we had together when he was there. I thought he's a good guy, and unfortunately the Liberals have failed me, and I can't really think of a way by which they need to fix themselves. Right? They're a big party. They've got $100 million of funding every year. Why can't they fix themselves and get back to like there's a Menzies Center, for example, where Nick Cater runs the show, and he provides training on liberalism. I think it's a 2 or 3 day course. Let them go back and do the course. Well, I think liberalism is well known and well understood, and they should have known it.
Now, if anyone wants to look up further some of the work that you've done around public health, or your views on liberalism, or anti-fascism, or anything of that sort of stuff, where can people find some of this material if they want to look it up?
Well, I suppose the best place is my personal blog, where I've got about 5,000 articles of some sort. It's called sabhlokcity.com.
Sabhlokcity.com,
Yeah.
and that's available for public viewing.
That's for public viewing, of course.
Yeah.
And then I've got hundreds of articles in the Times of India blog. I've got many articles in Times of India, Australian, the Financial Review, and of course books and so on. So and I prefer to get my material out there free of cost as far as possible. Unfortunately, it's not possible in all cases, but that's my goal. Unfortunately, it didn't happen with these last 2 books I wrote here. So this work I'm doing on public health is completely free. I intend to keep it completely free in perpetuity. It's going to have 1 million words, already 100,000 words. It's a bit sketchy and a bit problematic in terms of reading and so on. But look, over the course of the next 2 years, people will see it evolve. They can contribute. I've actually invited people to participate in that, like be a co-author, send me some articles that you want to write, because this is like in my view, this is the only piece ever done in history that reviews public health from scratch. And so I don't mind if it goes into 10 volumes with 2 million words. It doesn't matter, so long as there's sufficient material there for everyone to see and understand. So on ethics, for example, I've only got 7 or 10,000 words, and I've written 2 articles in Times of India. So I think what I'm saying is that the material is there in my blog, and it's linked to my blog. If you search for me, you'll find it. If you search on artificial intelligence softwares like ChatGPT, I'm sure you'll find it. And so it's basically over to people.
Thank you. I appreciate your time, Sanjeev. Thank you for sharing your perspectives today.
Thanks, Ron.
If you enjoyed that interview with Mr. Sanjeev Sabhlok and you share some of his concerns, check out sabhlokcity.com. At the same time, if there are any elements of what Sanjeev has talked about and you disagree with that, do let us know your thoughts. We appreciate that a lot of people right now are starting to take an interest into the political affairs of Australia, and if you have any questions, please send them to us, and if it's a question that Sanjeev can answer, we will forward them for you.